The room was cold. The lights above him flickered as he lay on the metallic table, staring up at the smooth, blank ceiling. It felt sterile, almost too perfect, the kind of perfection that made him uneasy. His wrists were strapped down and his legs were bound to the table with soft, unyielding restraints. He had no idea how he ended up here. One moment he had been fighting on the front lines, surrounded by blasters and explosions. The next, he was lying here in this strange alien medical facility, with no memory of how he'd been captured. It was as though the universe had decided he would be someone's experiment. A soft click echoed in the silence, followed by the quiet shuffle of feet. A figure appeared beside him. A nurse, but not like any nurse he had ever seen before. She was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like polished silver, and her face was a perfect blend of alien beauty, both otherworldly and serene. Her eyes, dark and elongated, never once met his as she worked. There was a sense of calm about her, a kind of detached professionalism that made him feel like he was nothing more than a specimen under her care. He tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, and no sound came out. The restraints held him still, his body powerless. He wanted to scream, to ask what was happening, but he couldn't. The nurse moved around him, her hands delicate and precise, as she prepared something he couldn't quite see. The air seemed thick with tension, and his heart raced. He couldn't help but wonder if he was about to die. The nurse hummed quietly to herself as she worked, her movements fluid. She turned back to him, her gaze never meeting his, as though he were invisible. Then she held up a syringe, its needle gleaming in the light. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The liquid inside was a pale, glowing blue, and it swirled as though alive, its consistency unlike any medicine he had ever encountered. Without a word, the nurse leaned over him. She gently lifted his arm and pressed the cold needle into his skin. He flinched, but his body was too weak to resist. The needle slid in with ease, and the fluid was injected into his bloodstream. He could feel it as it moved through him, a strange, tingling sensation that started at the point of the needle and spread outward. It was like fire and ice all at once, burning, yet freezing his veins. It didn't hurt exactly, but it was deeply uncomfortable. What is this?" he finally managed to croak, his voice weak. The nurse did not respond. She simply withdrew the needle and placed it back onto a tray without sparing him a glance. For a moment, he thought she hadn't heard him. But then, as she turned away, she spoke softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "This wasn't for humans," she said.
But don't say a word. Her words sent a chill down his spine. His mind raced.
What wasn't for humans? What did that mean? She moved to the side of the room, where strange machines hummed quietly. He watched as she operated them, with precise movements, her focus completely on the task at hand. He tried to lift his arm, but it felt heavier than before. He struggled to move his legs, but they were stiff. What did she mean? He thought again. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. The sensation from the injection was intensifying, and his vision blurred slightly. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus, but the edges of the room seemed to sway, as if the walls were alive and breathing. The feeling was strange, alien. His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Had they put something in him? Was this some kind of alien experiment? He had heard rumors of strange technologies used by the enemy, but he never imagined he would be the one subjected to it. His hands gripped the restraints harder, the leather biting into his skin as if it were some kind of symbol of his helplessness. His pulse quickened as the nurse continued her work, seemingly unfazed by his struggle. She moved with grace and precision, but the chill in the air only grew colder as he lay there, unable to move, unable to speak, caught in this strange alien world. The moment dragged on. He could feel the power of the drug coursing through his system. Something was happening to him, and he wasn't sure if it was good or bad. His body felt different. Every breath he took seemed to fill him with an odd electric energy, as if he could feel the very molecules of the air around him. It was as if every sense in his body had been heightened to an unnatural degree. His hearing sharpened. He could hear the hum of the machinery more clearly, the soft hiss of the air vents, the distant sounds of footsteps outside the room. The nurse's movements were almost too loud, like 1,000 whispers echoing in his mind. The strange sensation was spreading, and he tried to focus on the sound of his own breathing to ground himself, but the air itself felt thick, heavy, with unspoken words. Suddenly, the nurse turned toward him, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem to notice his discomfort, or perhaps she didn't care. She was distant, detached, a professional doing her job, and that was all. "You'll be fine," she said, as though she were comforting him. "Just rest." They only left him with more questions. Why hadn't she answered his question? Why hadn't she explained anything? He wanted to demand answers, to scream at her, but his mouth remained shut. His mind raced with thoughts he couldn't express, trapped in a body that seemed to be changing. The nurse turned her back to him once again, continuing her work. He could feel the shift inside him, the way his body was reacting to the alien substance that had been forced into him. It was like a fire that had been lit deep within his core, one that wasn't just burning, it was evolving. But before he could think any more on it, the door to the room opened, and the nurse walked out, without a single glance back. Alone in the cold, sterile room, he was left with his racing thoughts, and the strange feeling that something had just begun. A transformation, perhaps, or the beginning of a much larger story than he could ever have imagined. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that whatever the nurse had injected into him, it wasn't going to be easy to undo. The protagonist woke up feeling different. The first thing he noticed was how strange his body felt, as if it had been stretched and pulled in ways he couldn't explain. His mind was cloudy, like waking from a long dream. It took a moment to remember where he was. The cold, sterile room, the strange alien nurse, and the mysterious injection all flooded back to him in an overwhelming rush. He sat up slowly, feeling a twinge of discomfort as he moved. The restraints that had once held him down were gone, but the memory of them lingered. His body felt strange. He was lighter, yet somehow heavier at the same time. His muscles felt tense, like they were ready to spring into action. But there was a weird, uncomfortable sensation beneath his skin, as if something was shifting inside him. He swung his legs off the bed and stood, wobbling slightly as his feet touched the cool floor. He felt as though his balance had shifted, as if the weight of his own body wasn't quite where it should be. But it wasn't just his balance that had changed. Every inch of him seemed sharper, more aware. The sound of his footsteps echoed loudly in the quiet room, and he could hear his own breathing clearly in his ears. The strange feeling from the injection was still there, but it had grown stronger. His heart raced as he looked around the room, his senses heightened in ways that felt unnatural. He could hear the soft hum of the air vents, the rustling of his clothes, the faintest sound of distant voices echoing down the hall. Everything felt louder, clearer, as though his senses had been turned up to an impossible degree. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the overwhelming sensations. But something told him that it wasn't just the injection causing this. His body had changed somehow, in a way that he couldn't yet understand. He tried to steady himself, but his hands were shaking. He could feel the heat of the blood rushing through his veins, and his body felt like it was on fire. The tingling sensation from the injection still lingered in his bloodstream, and it wasn't going away. It was almost as if the strange substance had become a part of him, something that was now intertwined with his very being. He looked at his hands, flexing his fingers, and watching the way his muscles moved beneath his skin. His hands were steady now, the shaking subsiding. But he noticed something odd. The veins in his arms seemed to be more pronounced, almost glowing in the dim light of the room. He could feel the blood moving through them, pulsing with a strange energy. It wasn't like anything he had experienced before. He needed answers. The nurse's cryptic words echoed in his mind. This wasn't for humans, she had said. Don't say a word. But why? Why had she done this to him? What was in that syringe? And why had she been so secretive about it? His mind raced as he paced the small room. He had to find out what had happened. What was happening to him? He couldn't just sit there and let whatever was going on inside his body take over. But he also knew he had to be careful. The nurse had warned him not to speak, and there was a part of him that wondered what would happen if he did. Were there consequences to questioning them? Were there forces at play that he didn't understand? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, almost painful sensation in his head. It was like a sudden rush of information, a flood of thoughts and images that weren't his own. He staggered backward, his hand flying to his head as if to steady the overwhelming pressure. For a moment the world spun around him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with unfamiliar sounds and feelings. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The sensation passed as quickly as it had come, but it left him shaken. Whatever had been injected into him, it wasn't just changing his body. It was changing his mind as well. He could feel his thoughts moving faster, clearer, as if everything around him was suddenly in focus. He walked to the door of the room, trying to push down the rising panic in his chest. The strange sensations were growing stronger by the minute, and he didn't know how much longer he could ignore them. He reached for the door handle, but something stopped him. A feeling, a deep sense that there was more to this place than met the eye. He turned around and looked at the room. It was sterile, almost clinical in its design, with white walls and cold metal furniture. But there was something unsettling about it, something wrong. The nurse had said he would be fine. She had told him to rest. But he wasn't sure if he could trust her, and he definitely wasn't sure if he could trust anything he had been told since being brought here. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to clear his head. He had to focus. He needed to figure out what was happening to him. He had to find out what was in that injection. But how? As he stood there, his mind spinning with possibilities, a soft noise interrupted his thoughts. A click, a light sound of footsteps, faint but growing closer. His senses immediately zeroed in on the noise, and he could hear every detail of the movement, how the shoes scuffed against the floor, how the weight shifted with each step. He couldn't help but be amazed by how his hearing had changed. It was as though he could hear every creak of the building, every shift of the air. The door to the room opened, and the nurse stepped inside. Her silver skin glimmered in the light, and her calm, professional demeanor remained unchanged. She didn't look surprised to see him standing, though she did glance at him briefly, her eyes flicking over his body as if assessing something. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice almost too calm. "How are you feeling?" He didn't trust his voice at first. There was so much he wanted to say, so many questions bubbling up inside him. But instead of speaking, he focused on the way she was standing. Too still, too perfect. There was something about her presence that made him uneasy. She wasn't acting like a person. She was acting like a machine, an emotionless figure with no concern for his well-being. I feel strange," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "What did you do to me? What's in that injection?" The nurse tilted her head slightly, as if considering his question. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked past him, moving with a quiet grace, as though his presence didn't even register. He watched her, his eyes narrowing as she moved around the room, her movements precise and calculated. She stopped at the medical equipment and began adjusting a few settings, her back turned to him. She seemed to ignore him completely, as if he were no longer of any importance. "You're not supposed to remember," she said at last, her voice still calm, but there was something colder in it now. "You were never meant to know what's inside you."
"What do you mean?" he demanded. "What's inside me?"
"What's happening to me?" The nurse didn't turn to face him. "It's not for humans," she repeated, her voice colder than before. "And it wasn't for you, either.
but there's no going back now.
He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but something in her words held him back. She had said he wasn't meant to remember. Whatever had been injected into him, it was something dangerous, something that wasn't meant for human bodies.
Why me? He asked, his voice quieter now, his fear and confusion bubbling to the surface.
Why did you choose me? The nurse finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable.
It was never a choice, she said. You were selected.
She paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to say more. The experiment was never meant to be a success. But you're more resilient than we thought. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. He didn't understand what she meant, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't going to stop. He was caught in something much larger than himself. The strange energy coursing through his body was impossible to ignore. Every nerve in his body was alive with heightened awareness. Every sensation was sharper, clearer, more vivid than ever before. The nurse's words echoed in his mind. You're more resilient than we thought. He didn't understand what she meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him was changing. The room seemed brighter, the sounds sharper, and even the air felt different, heavier. The nurse left him alone after their brief conversation, leaving the door slightly ajar as she disappeared into the hallway. His eyes followed her retreating figure, but there was no comfort in her absence. There was only a strange emptiness that hung in the air. The feeling that whatever had been done to him could never be undone. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. The sensations inside him weren't just physical, they were mental too. His thoughts moved faster, more clearly. He could think of things and know them instantly, without the usual delays. The mental fog he had felt earlier had lifted, and his mind was as sharp as a blade. But with that sharpness came an overwhelming sense of confusion. What had they done to him? He looked at his hands again. The veins were more pronounced, the skin paler, and there was a subtle warmth radiating from under the surface, as though his very blood had been altered. Every movement felt controlled, precise, as though his body was now aware of every small shift it made. It was like being in a new body, one that didn't quite belong to him. He stood up, feeling the weight of his body shift as though he were moving through a dream. His legs felt stronger than before, yet lighter, like he could run faster, jump higher. His senses were so sharp, he could hear the smallest sounds, the scrape of the door against the floor as it moved just slightly, the whisper of his clothes as they shifted on his body, even the faint hum of distant voices outside the room. His hearing was almost unbearable, and he pressed his hands against his ears to try to dull the noise. But no matter what he did, the sharpness of his senses remained. Something had changed. But the question was, what had been injected into him, and why? His mind began to race again. The nurse had said it wasn't for humans. But what was it? Why had they chosen him? The thought of being part of some twisted experiment made his stomach turn. But what if there was more to this? What if he wasn't just a subject? What if there was a purpose to all of this? He could feel it deep inside him. There was a power in him now, something raw and untapped. It wasn't just strength, though. It was a feeling of control. He reached out and touched the wall, testing his senses. The surface felt rough, and he could feel every texture and vivid detail. He could even feel the heat radiating from it, like the wall itself was alive. His senses were expanding beyond his understanding, and the more he focused, the more the world around him became clearer. He walked across the room, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. Every movement was fluid, graceful. His body obeyed him without hesitation, and for the first time since his capture, he felt as though he had control over something. But control of what? What was happening to him? He paused by the door, staring at the narrow crack between the door and the frame. There was something beyond that door, something he needed to understand. He couldn't stay in the dark about this anymore. The urge to find answers pushed him forward. His body was telling him to move, to act, but his mind hesitated. What if there were more dangers waiting for him on the other side? He had no idea what kind of creatures or beings were out there. The thought of walking into the unknown made his heart race, but it wasn't fear that drove him. It was the need for answers. He stepped out into the hallway. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The hallway was dimly lit, with walls that stretched on either side, endless and narrow. There were doors on either side, some closed, some slightly ajar. The air smelled sterile, clean, and somehow that only heightened the feeling of unease. It felt as if everything here was controlled, calculated. He moved forward, his footsteps barely making a sound. He wasn't sure where he was going, but his body seemed to know. His senses, now sharper than ever, picked up on the faintest sounds, the soft rustling of fabric from behind a door, the low murmur of voices at the far end of the hall. His hearing, which had once been average at best, was now so acute that it was almost overwhelming. The faintest noise felt like a loud echo, and each sound carried with it information he wasn't sure he wanted. But then, through the silence, he heard something that made him freeze. But these were different. These were heavy, deliberate steps, and they were coming closer. He held his breath, trying to make himself as small as possible, pressing himself against the wall as quietly as he could. He waited in the shadows, his pulse racing as the footsteps drew nearer. He could hear the rhythm of the person's steps, the slight shift of their weight as they moved. It was as if he could sense their every movement, almost as if he could feel the very air around them. The sensation was unsettling, but he couldn't help but be fascinated by it. The figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was tall, humanoid, with skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light. He recognized it immediately. It was one of the aliens that had been present when he was first captured. The nurse had spoken of them, but seeing one up close was different. This one had an air of authority, its posture straight, its eyes scanning the hallway with practiced precision. The alien didn't notice him at first. It stopped for a moment, pausing as though listening for something. The silence between them felt deafening, but the longer he stood there, the more it seemed like the alien was waiting for something. He held his breath, trying to make himself as invisible as possible. Then, without warning, the alien turned, its gaze falling on him. For a moment, the two of them locked eyes. The alien's expression was unreadable, but there was a strange shift in its stance, as if it had just realized something important. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. He didn't move. He couldn't. His body felt frozen, as though it had been caught in a trap. And then, in a voice that was both smooth and unsettling, the alien spoke. "You shouldn't be out here." The words felt like a warning, and yet there was a strange curiosity behind them. The alien seemed to study him, as if calculating something in its mind. "I'm just looking for answers," he replied, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline in his veins. The alien didn't respond right away. Instead, it took a step closer, its movements deliberate and slow. "Answers?" "You've already received them," it said softly. "But you are not ready to understand."
The words struck him like a blow.
Not ready to understand? What did that mean? He had to know more. He had to understand what had been done to him, and why. "I don't care about what's ready or not," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I want to know what's happening to me."
"What you've done to me!"
The alien didn't answer immediately. It seemed to consider his words, its eyes narrowing slightly. "You will learn," it said, its tone cold. "But not now." Without another word, the alien turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway as quickly as it had come. He was left standing there, his mind racing. He had learned something. Whatever this was, it wasn't just an experiment. There was something bigger at play. The alien had mentioned learning, but why had it been so cryptic, and what did it mean by not ready to understand? He had to know. He had to find the answers. There was no turning back now. He moved deeper into the facility, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the unknown was pressing down on him. The hallway stretched out in front of him, the dim lights flickering overhead. He had to keep moving. The words of the alien echoed in his mind. "You're not ready to understand." But what did that mean? What had been done to him? And why? He passed several doors, each one looking the same as the last. His senses were still heightened, and it was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that something was watching him. He didn't know who or what, but he could sense it. A presence in the walls, in the air. Something that didn't belong. The adrenaline coursing through him made his heartbeat echo in his ears. His body felt like it was on fire, every nerve tingling with unnatural energy. The injection had changed him, and though he could feel the power it gave him, it also left him with an emptiness, a constant pull for something more, answers, or perhaps freedom from this strange alien world he was trapped in. As he reached the end of the hallway, he noticed another door, much larger than the others. There was something different about it. It felt heavier, more significant. He could feel it. It was as though the door itself was guarding something important. The air around it seemed thick, almost oppressive. He approached it cautiously, listening for any signs of movement behind the door. There was nothing, just the same silence that had followed him throughout the hallways. But his gut told him that whatever was beyond this door would finally give him the answers he so desperately needed. His hand reached for the door handle, and for a moment he hesitated. What if opening this door brought more danger? What if it was another trap? But then he remembered the nurse's words. You were selected. What if this was part of whatever twisted experiment they were running? He turned the handle. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. The room was vast, and at first he couldn't make sense of it. The space was filled with strange equipment. Some he recognized, most he didn't. Machines hummed quietly, their screens glowing with data he couldn't understand. But it wasn't the machines that caught his attention. It was the figure standing at the far side of the room. The nurse, she was there, standing motionless, her back to him as she worked at a console. But she wasn't alone. There was a group of other aliens standing with her, their expressions cold, their eyes fixed on the screens before them. They all wore uniforms that looked similar to the one the nurse had worn, though these were darker, more official. He took a step forward, his body tense, but the nurse seemed to sense him before he could move any closer. Without turning, she spoke, her voice calm and almost detached. You shouldn't be here. Her words only pushed him forward. He couldn't stop now. He had to know what was going on. He had to find out what was happening to him. I'm not going anywhere until I get answers, he said, his voice louder than he meant. There was a long pause, and for a moment he thought she might ignore him. But then she finally turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the injection. There was something different in her gaze. Something almost regretful. I told you, she said, her voice still calm. You were never supposed to understand. He didn't know what she meant by that, but he wasn't going to back down now. Tell me what's happening to me. Why did you do this? She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. It was the first sign of emotion he had seen from her, and it made him feel both anxious and hopeful at the same time. She walked toward him slowly, the other aliens behind her remaining still, watching silently. You're not the first, she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. But you're the most successful? He blinked, his mind racing as he tried to process her words. Successful, he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Instead, she gestured for him to sit, and reluctantly, he complied. His legs felt like jelly, his nerves still on edge, but he knew he had to hear this. "The injection," she began, "was part of an experiment, a test to see if human DNA could be adapted, enhanced." She paused, her eyes briefly glancing at the other aliens, who remained silent. "We wanted to see if humans could survive, thrive even, with the introduction of alien biology. We've been running tests for years." "And you," she looked at him, her eyes studying him carefully. "You're the first to succeed." The words didn't fully make sense to him. Succeed? What did she mean by that?
"You're not just human anymore," she continued. "What's inside you now, it's something beyond that."
Something more. His mind reeled as he tried to process what she was saying. Something more? He didn't know what that meant, but he could feel the difference inside him, deep in his bones. He could feel the power, the energy. But now he understood it wasn't just physical. It was genetic. His very DNA had been altered. He looked at her, his heart racing. "What does that mean for me?" "Am I just a lab rat to you?" She shook her head slowly, almost sadly.
No, you're more than that. You've become a bridge, in a way.
A connection between our species and yours. But that doesn't make you any less of a test subject. Her voice softened, and for a moment she seemed to struggle with the words. "You're part of something much bigger, and it's not something you can control."
What does that mean? What's the bigger plan here?
She looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. "We've been trying to create a hybrid species," she finally said. "A race that could be stronger, more resilient, and more adaptable than anything either of our species could be on their own. You are the result of that experiment." And now she hesitated, almost as if she were unsure of how much to say. "Now what?" he demanded, his voice rising. She looked at the aliens behind her, and they nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. She seemed to take a deep breath before continuing. "Now you have a choice," she said softly. "You can be a part of this project, a leader, even. You could join us in this new future we're creating. Or
You can leave, and we will erase everything we've done to you. You'll return to your life, but you won't remember any of this."
the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. They had been experimenting on him, but now they were offering him a place in their new world. As if it were that simple. He stared at her, his mind spinning. Could he trust them? Could he accept what they had done to him? The power inside him, the changes in his body. It was overwhelming, but it was also intoxicating. He felt stronger, faster, more aware of everything around him. But was it worth it? Was the price too high? He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the door slammed open. The sound of rushing footsteps filled the room, and the aliens instantly became alert. It was the figure from earlier, the one who had spoken to him in the hallway, the alien with the authority. It stepped into the room, its eyes fixed on him with an unreadable expression.
"You have made your decision, I see," the alien said, its voice calm but commanding. "But be warned."
Once you choose, there is no going back. The nurse looked at him one last time, her face full of unreadable emotion. "Choose wisely," she said quietly, before turning and walking away. He stood there for a long time, torn between two worlds, the power within him, the uncertainty of what was to come, and the weight of the decision before him. The future was in his hands now, but it was a future that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding, and for the first time he made his choice.